Can I just ask you again about the local issue? So this is one of the things that we talk about in the class quite a bit, the local versus global. And it turns out I mean, again, as a philosopher, I don't really know any of this stuff, so I'm coming in a little bit ignorant, but trying to learn quickly about some of the debates. And it looks to me like there's a certain amount of controversy about things you would think are just intuitive. Like, it turns out that the economies of scale of some of the global production facilities are such that even if you do ship a bunch of oranges in a Boeing 747 across an ocean, you still end up spending less in terms of energy and fossil fuels than a really small-scale local producer driving a small truck and going to the farmer's market, and then we go to the farmer's market and just buy a few things there, and then we have to go to the supermarket and so forth. So the food miles rubric turns out to be at least controversial, such that it's not always clear that from the point of view of fossil fuel use and energy use that buying local is better. So
I think that it's been interesting to see this debate kind of grow, and it does feel like an attack on local farmers markets with some very big money behind that attack. I don't think it's so clear cut. I mean, the first question would be, I don't think that your example of the oranges, I don't think the evidence is there to say industrially produced food shipped abroad will have a lower amount of greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuel use than locally produced food purchased at the farmer's market.
And like I said,
It depends on, I think, so I've looked at the data for comparison, and there's a wide amount of data looking, but they focused on transportation only. And so I think when you start to do life cycle analysis, it gets more complicated. And that is trying to take into account how foods are grown and how they're stored once they're moved places. So when you start to take into account the amount of fertilizer that's applied, how that fertilizer is produced, how it's shipped, and the pesticides that are applied and how they are grown or produced and how they're shipped, not grown, but how they're shipped, and then applied to the crop. So when you take those production questions into account and then also the refrigeration on the other end, then your oranges stop looking so environmentally friendly. And again, your questions of efficiency, if you're just looking at transportation and you're not looking at who's selling it, who's benefiting from the sale, and the sort of whole picture of the environmental costs, then you're ignoring some of those bigger questions about equity and about the whole picture of the environmental costs.
Yeah, I take the point about worker situations. I guess I'm mostly following James McWilliams, who is an author who's actually coming to speak to the class, and we're going to interview him. But he's got a book called Just Food, where he basically says that the food miles rubric is not a helpful way of analyzing these things. And then he does do the life cycle analysis and talks about what that means, and then shows in all of these really interesting examples with a lot of footnotes. Again, I'm not really capable of judging, but shows that what you would kind of commonsensically think would be better for the environment turns out not to be. So I'm just following him. But let's suppose that he's got something like a case, and so set aside the efficiency issue or the carbon footprint issue. Is there a reason to buy local that isn't going to amount to a kind of, I don't know,
economic question? Or?
Well, I was thinking more a kind of tribalism. I mean, so we like our region to be flourishing, and we like the people that we see at the market and maybe driving around to have money, and so we want to support our local community. And that does mean that we're taking money away, not just from the corporations and the executives, but also from the farmer in Brazil or the farmer in Mexico, who would have been the recipient of at least some of our food dollars if we'd been buying from the global food system. Is there a reason apart from emissions questions to go local that isn't going to be just a kind of tribalism?
I mean, tribalism is a funny word. I guess I think there is something inherently important about the social connection from knowing who is growing your food and knowing something about the food and having that greater connection. I think helps build community, helps build trust, and there's a lot of scholarship in sociology about how disconnected we are from our food and how that is also a disconnection with kind of nature and rural and so I think there may be some inherent value in, not I think, I really do think there's an inherent value in reconnecting us with where our food is coming from. And I think part of that means buying from local farmers. I guess I'm very skeptical of the claims that this author is making and others about the environmental impacts. Something just really doesn't sound right about that. Certainly from my reading of the literature, I really don't think the evidence is weighted in the favor of industrial food being shipped elsewhere. And then if you think about, the Brazilian farmer, I don't think there's anything wrong with buying some, products from the global south. I certainly still drink coffee, but trying to make sure that they actually benefit from the transaction, I think, is so important. And that is going to require connections, and so building relations with other places internationally that doesn't rely on an anonymous corporation telling you, oh no, they're getting a good deal from this transaction, I think is part of what needs to change.